Hey everyone, thanks again for tuning in to this first episode of the From Pain to PRs podcast. If you're dealing with tendon pain and not sure where to start, I'll be dropping a free guide as far as how you should start approaching your tendon pain. If you'd like to receive this guide, either send me an email at ryan@ascensionrf.com, or you can send me a DM on Instagram at Ascension Rehab CLT. No spaces in between any of that. Those will also be listed in the show notes below. Thanks again for tuning in. Thank you everyone for tuning in to this very first episode of the From Pain to PRs podcast. With this podcast, my goal is to be able to give you some reliable information about common injuries, how to address your activity after you get injured, and really just be able to be a tool to dive through a lot of the, let's just say, not so great information that's out there. And oftentimes some of the not so great information that's out there is even coming from the clinicians that you see in person. So I'm hoping that this podcast will be able to give you the tools that you need to start managing some of the injuries on your own, and honestly be even better than some of the clinics that you step into when you go to get something assessed and treated. My own experience with the topic that we're going to talk about today, and the reason I chose it is not just my own experience, but because it's one of the most common things I treat, is tendon pain. So with tendon pain, it's an extremely complex issue. There's a lot of things that feed into tendon pain, and it's often totally mismanaged and totally misunderstood. I had my own experience with a tendon tear, and there was an extremely long rehab process that went with that because it led to a cascade of issues. And my hope is that I can help some of you who are maybe dealing with those same issues to find a way to get out of them. So, without further ado, let's talk a little bit about tendon pain. First, we got to talk about what are tendons. So tendons, they're basically just anchors. They anchor muscle to bone. They're made of stiff, tough collagen fibers. And if you want to think about a good example of this, think about a really strong bungee cord. You know, it can be pretty stiff, but at the same time, there's quite a bit of resistance to it. You ever try just like breaking a bungee cord with your hand? If it's a really good one, probably not going to happen. With tendons, they often get injured from one of two scenarios. Either there was an acute overload or a chronic overload. So an acute overload is going to be you did something in that instance that totally overwhelmed the ability of that tendon to be able to handle the force you're putting on it. You know, a great example of this is for someone who's a runner, and you'll see it a lot of times in football too, where they go to plant hard right off the bat, so they try to really put a lot of force in their Achilles tendon, and the Achilles tendon just bursts. We get a total tear of that Achilles tendon. That would be an example of an acute overload. A chronic overload is going to be where you've done more activity over time than the tendon is able to heal from. Going back to our bungee cord example, there's one difference between a tendon and a bungee cord that's extremely important. Tendons, like most of the tissues in the human body, have the ability to heal and repair themselves, which is absolutely amazing when you think about it. So imagine you had this rope or bungee cord that it gets some small frays in it, and then your body's able to heal those frays. It's pretty crazy. But if we're loading more than the tendon can adapt to, because there's only so much load that the tendon can adapt to, and there's a variety of things that feed into that, but there's only so much load that it can adapt to, that if we overwhelm that ability to adapt, then that's where we can start having those small frays become bigger frays, and then we start getting some pain with that too. Along with just overloading it, sleep can play a major role into it. There's been a big link between tendinopathy and sleep. There's stress management can play a role into it, nutrition. There's a lot of things that feed into it, but ultimately it's making sure that when you're exercising, you're not overloading that tendon more than it's capable of adapting to. And these are the small little things that are going on over time. Some of these changes could be going on underneath the surface before you even start having pain. So you heard me mention the word tendinopathy. Tendinopathy, when you're talking about tendon pain, that's the term that you want to use, because tendinopathy, it's basically an overarching term that includes tendinitis and tendinosis. A lot of times people think that they have tendinitis, but in fact, they're likely just dealing with some form of tendon pain, possibly tendinosis. So when we break down the terms, tendinopathy, the pathy actually stands for disorder. There is some kind of disorder going on with the tendon. In the case of tendinitis, that's indicating that there's inflammation. That's where the itis comes from in tendinitis. Most of the time, you're not dealing with tendinitis. Typically, that's just going to be in the first few days, and you're going to notice with that you're having some of those symptoms of inflammation, like redness and swelling. Tendinosis, especially if you've been dealing with that pain for a long time, like we're talking months or years, tendinosis is likely what you're dealing with. And what tendinosis is, there's been structural changes in the tendon over time. You can get pain with tendinosis, but with that pain, there's not typically inflammation. There's a lot of other factors that can create pain. Pain is not solely based on inflammation alone. A lot of doom and gloom there, I know. But the good thing, these are very treatable issues too. When it comes to the tendon, we talked about earlier, it comes down to either an acute or chronic overload. For the football player who goes to plant and his Achilles pops, we know likely what caused that too. It was a rapid amount of force. His Achilles tendon wasn't ready to handle it. It could have been that he had some lingering stuff going on underneath the surface that finally just put enough load on it in one instance and just boom, there it went. But a lot of times we're seeing just chronic overload. So you have to figure out why it's getting overloaded chronically. This could simply be due to the fact you're just throwing more training at that tendon than it can handle. Like if, in the great example, patellar tendon, the tendon that sits at the bottom of the kneecap. If you're doing a lot of squatting, a lot of running, just more than your body's able to adapt to, then that tendon's going to slowly start to break down over time. Anytime we exercise any tissue, as we exercise, the tissue breaks down, but then as we rest and sleep, keyword being sleep here, that tissue is going to repair itself even better than it was before. But if we're breaking down more than we can repair, that constant breakdown starts to add up over a while. Along with looking at how much training we're doing, we also have to figure out biomechanically, are we moving in a certain way that's exposing that tendon to a little bit more force? The knee's also a great example of this too, where if you're not moving well through the hip or the ankle, or say if there's even something sneaking under the surface in your low back, very important that if you're having issues in your lower body, you need your lower back checked out, that if we're dealing with issues there, it can start to crop up as tendon pain lower down into the leg. And that's simply because that tendon is doing more than it should be doing during certain tasks. Once you figure out why it's overloaded, you need to reduce the load that's been being put on that tendon, but then gradually you want to build that load back up. Tendons, again, they're meant to be tough tissues. They're meant to be able to handle a lot of load. So part of the rehab for tendon pain needs to be some heavy loading. We want that tendon to be stiff to an extent. We want it to be able to handle a lot of force. A lot of people think that they need to rest and stretch. Beyond the first couple days, it's okay to rest a little bit. That's not going to have any harm, but in the long term, if we rest, that tendon is never going to get back that strength that we need, that stiffness that we need. So then what starts to happen is when we go to exercise again, it's that much more susceptible to being overloaded. And then this cycle continues. We back off activity, then that tendon becomes used to handling less load, and then so on and so forth. And that's where a lot of these chronic issues that don't get addressed appropriately stem from. Stretching. So stretching is actually one of the last things you want to do when dealing with tendon pain, because with stretching, you're just going to push that tendon up against the bone that it attaches to and make it really, really upset. And think about the example I'll use for stretching when we're dealing with tears in tissue, whether it's a muscle strain or we're dealing with tendinosis, that if think of a hole in your shirt, just think of a hole in your shirt, and think about trying to stretch that hole. What's it going to do? It's probably going to get worse. What you should do instead is sew that hole back up. And that's where strength training comes into play. That's where building it back. Our body builds that back by strength training. It can repair a lot of those tissues. So stretching is not one of the first things that you want to do with dealing with tendon pain. It'll feel good at first to stretch, but that's just from the temporary feel-good sensation of stretching. after a while, that is going to really start to wear down on that tendon. The pain will just come back with a vengeance. Along with stiffness, what we also need the tendons to be is elastic. That's where the example of the bungee cord comes into play. We need it to be able to recoil fast. So if we think about running, jumping, all of our plyometric patterns, we're putting the tendon under a short stretch, but a loaded stretch, and then quickly recoiling from that stretch. So that's where if you're dealing with tendon pain, along with the heavy loading, you're probably going to need some plyometric force to be able to teach that tendon to be able to absorb that load and then quickly recoil in the opposite direction. Really, when it comes down to it, when dealing with any form of tendon pain, the take home here is you got to figure out why that tendon is getting overloaded. Once you figure out why it's getting overloaded, then you can address why that's happening. And then you start to gradually load it again. And gradually loading it again, in the vast majority of cases, it's what's going to get you long-lasting relief and get you back to the things that you want to do. Simply resting and stretching is not going to do the trick.